In comments under a couple of videos I did, one on the most important watches and one on the smartwatch and what it means for the Swiss luxury watch industry, a few of you have come back and said I didn't really address the elephant in the room, and that is the collapse at the bottom end of the Swiss watch market and the collapse of volume within that market. I didn't address it, and I didn't address it deliberately because I don't think it's that big a deal. I'll talk about why now. Hi, welcome back to Not So Obvious Watches. I'm Pete McConville. Particularly in my video talking about why I didn't think smartwatches were much of a threat to the luxury watch game, a few of you commented and said I was kind of ignoring the massive reduction in volume of the Swiss watch industry. That's true. I did ignore it. And I suppose I ignored it kind of deliberately. The first thing is I danced around the idea of a luxury watch, and I did so deliberately. Generally, some of you have tried to pin a luxury watch to a value like 3,000 francs or something like that. I'm going to go with something slightly different and say that a luxury watch is any watch that someone buys as a luxury, i.e. they don't need it to tell the time. They just want it because it's helpful, it's nice, it's something that they want to wear, it's jewelry. And so that's going to generally skew towards more expensive watches. Certainly it's going to skew towards mechanical watches. But I didn't really go into that. I just left the door open for the general category of luxury watches, being things that people buy purely for their desirability, not because of any kind of functionality. So with that said, now let's get in and look at some of the detail of what's actually gone wrong or right with the Swiss watch industry over the last 19 to 20 years. Sorry, but I'm going to put you to some graphs now. Okay, so if you look at the graph and look over on the extreme right-hand column, and yes, and then slide down that column and looking at thousands of units, it is clear there's been a massive reduction in the number of Swiss watches sold since 2000 to the end of 2019. 29.6 million units shifted in 2000 and only 20.6 million units in 2019. So that's a fall of 9 million units, almost a third in a little bit under 20 years. That's terrible. That's awful. However, here's the problem. Now let's scroll across and look at how many electronic watches were sold in the year 2000. There was 27.2 million units. Now look how many were sold just in 5 years later. 20.1, near as damn at 21 million units. So that's a fall of over 7 million units in just 5 years. Look at what happens to electronic watches over the 15 years after that. And there's a bit of stabilization through 2010 and 2015. And then after 2015, just this constant fall, eventually losing another 7 million units between 2015 and 2019. Now let's scroll across and look at the mechanical movements. And what you see is there was only 2.4 million mechanical watches sold in 2000, up to 3.3 million in 2005, continuing to rise to 4.9 million in 2010, and then peaking at 7.8 million units just 5 years later. That is almost doubling the market in just 5 years. Now, if you look at what comes next, that was clearly overproduction. So then we see a fallback and then a more gradual rise with some oscillation around a number of 7.2-ish up to 7.5. But if you look at just the mechanical movements, or watches with mechanical movements, between 2000 and 2019, the number of mechanical movement watches sold increased from 2.4 million units per year to 7.2 million units per year. Not far off tripling the number of mechanical movement watches sold by the Swiss industry. So what I see in there is actually a replication of what we saw in the Quartz crisis. In the Quartz crisis, the number of Swiss watches sold absolutely plummeted. A little known fact is that the vast number of Swiss watches that were no longer sold, the vast number of the sales of Swiss watches after the Quartz crisis that were lost were cheap and cheerful pin and lever or Roscoff movement watches. Yeah, we tend to think today that a Swiss watch is always a jeweled movement, high quality, last forever, blah, blah, blah. That wasn't always the case. Never make the mistake of thinking that yesterday was like today. The Swiss watch industry of the 70s that collapsed in the Quartz crisis was generally that segment of the market that sold cheap and cheerful pin and lever and Roscoff movements. Yes, that eventually began to, and we did lose some of the more prestigious brands, but that was kind of later when the currency and other issues started to really bite. The number one victim of the Quartz crisis, the quartz part of that, was actually the really cheap watches. And that's what we're seeing here if we look at what's happened to the Swiss watch industry. The really cheap stuff, the electronic stuff that isn't really germane to being Swiss, has been decimated. 50% of the market gone. But the mechanical stuff, the more expensive stuff, the more labor intensive stuff, the things which are more inherently and intrinsically Swiss, they have almost tripled in the number of being produced over the last 15 years. Actually, sorry, 19 years. Let's have another look at this, but now through the lens of price. Sorry, but this is going to be another one of those boring ones where we just look at panels of figures. Again, if we look over on the extreme right, what we see is the same as we saw before. A massive reduction in the number of watches, because that's the total number of units. As we said before, 29.6 million down to 20.6 million. 9 million units lost. What we see is the value across the board has gone up enormously from 9.2 billion Swiss francs up to 20.5 billion Swiss francs in 2019. If you look at the number of units being sold below 2,200 Swiss francs. So remember now, that's going to be all of these numbers that we're looking at here. That is wholesale price, the price that was marked on the export certificate leaving Switzerland. So it's wholesale. It's probably, we could call this most likely around about 40% of retail price. So when you see something like 200 Swiss francs, that would include watches that sell for around about $500. When you see things like 500 Swiss francs, that's going to be things that sell at about 1,000 or 1,200 US dollars. When we see 3,000 Swiss francs, that's going to be things that sell at about $7,000 to $8,000. So just bear that in mind. The prices that you're looking at here are wholesale prices charged by the manufacturer to the seller, not the price that you would be paying when you're buying it. So again, go back here. If we look at the prices for the export value, 200, less than 200 Swiss francs, or like to MSRPs, we're talking about 500 Swiss francs. Again, half the volume is gone. We've gone from 22 million of these units, 22.8 million of these units a year, has plummeted to 11.6 million units per year. I don't believe it's too much of a stretch. Now that 11 million units, I don't believe that is too much of a stretch to imagine that those 11 million units are almost entirely going to be quartz watches. And if we go back to the quartz watch area, what you're looking at again, that's fallen over that time by a little bit over 13 million units per year. So remember, 13 million units a year less of electronic watches. And in the bottom end of the market, we've lost 11 million units. So that would tend to indicate that with almost all of that loss is probably in the electronic game. Now, if we go up the price category, so now we're talking watches between MSRP 500 US up to about 1200 US, what you see here is a fairly stable view. The watch, there's a slight increase from 2000 up to about 2015, a little bit of fall off and some stabilization. Now, if you look up the price ranges, you see that as very common. If we go up to the 500 Swiss franc to 3,000 Swiss francs, so that's going to be watches from around with an MSRP of around about $1,200 to around about $7,000. Remarkably constant. The numbers being sold are very, very constant. Now, the value has gone up, and that would tend to indicate that some of these watches have been numbers of watches from the bottom end of the market, bottom end of that price range, are being replaced by watches at the top end of that price range. So we've seen the value of those watches go from 3.8 billion Swiss francs rising up into the fours. Not entirely consistent. It's a little bit all over the place, but I think it would be safe to say you can see there the numbers are about stable. The prices have gone up a little bit, which would indicate that the value of watches within that price brand have sort of moved towards the right. Now, all the big movement has clearly happened at watches that cost MSRPs of greater than $7,000. In the year 2000, they sold 488,000 of these watches. In the year 2019, they sold 1.6 million watches, almost 1.7 million watches above the price of, above an MSRP of probably $7,000. You also see the massive increase in the value of those exports. So they've gone from 3.1 billion Swiss francs to 14.2 billion Swiss francs a year in 2019. It's gone from being that really high end of the market, has gone from being worth less than the mid-range to being worth more than three times the value. Looking at these numbers, I don't see the death of the Swiss watch industry. I see the carve away of something that isn't really an inherent part of the Swiss watch industry. Well, certainly not the Swiss watch industry of the 21st century, and that is the cheap and cheerful commodity quartz watch. I don't think it's a bad thing for the Swiss watch industry to be done with that and to get rid of it. What we see is in the mechanical world across the board, massive growth in that end of the market, in both volume and in revenue. And we see some really, really strong growth the further up the price range you get. And that's, again, for the Swiss watch industry, that's, I believe, good news, because that's actually very difficult for other people to muscle in on. You can't muscle in on that really high end by getting cheap finance from a central government, by having cheap labor. That doesn't help you at that high end. I think that, and certainly at that high end, you are not competing with an Apple Watch. Now, I'd quickly like to finish up with a discussion around the impact of smartwatches on the sales of these electronic watches out of Switzerland. I think it would be easy to surmise that massive fall in electronic watches was largely driven as a result of the introduction of the Apple Watch and others, and that the rise of the Apple Watch is what's caused the plummeting of sales on the Swiss electronic watch area. I don't think that stacks up. The dates and numbers just don't quite work. Remember, if we look at the chart again, cheap electronic watches sold by the Swiss industry fell from 22.8 million to 18 million. So they dropped like 4 million in 2005, in 2000 and 2005, years before, a decade before we had a smartwatch even on the market. We saw some stabilization and then a massive fall after around about 2010. It starts to fall fairly consistently. Again, even if we stay in 2010, 2011, that is before, it's like 5-6 years before the rise of the Apple Watch. And I don't think that really does a particularly good job of explaining the fall off. I would actually say that I think it did certainly contribute, but I don't believe it was really what caused it. I think that there was two other things that happened around about 2010 that are far more significant in my mind. The first is G-Shock. You've got to remember that the Swiss watch industry doesn't exist in isolation, that there's every possibility that someone didn't buy a Swiss watch because they bought something else. And I'm firmly of the opinion that a lot of that shift happened from low-end budget, cheap and cheerful Swiss quartz watches to G-Shocks. I think, again, don't make the mistake of thinking that the past is like today. For much of its history, the G-Shock was not a particularly successful. Well, it was successful, but wasn't wildly popular. It wasn't like it is now. Not really cultish. That is a reasonably recent phenomenon. If you go back and look at, now it's very difficult to get hard information around G-Shock sales, but Casio themselves did an article a couple of years ago, which I think was really really helpful. And it was released just after they'd sold their 100th million G-Shock. And then they listed their most common G-Shocks, the watches, the G-Shocks which have sold more than any other. And what is interesting, they're all, two of the three are from 2010 onwards. So they were introduced in 2010, and one is a year or two earlier. I think it might be 2007, 2008. So what you see, that big gap, that massive fall you see happening after 2010, a lot of those watches would have been people switching across from 2010, 11, 12, 13, 14, etc., from low-end Swiss watches to G-Shocks. Something else really important happened in around about 2011, which I think would also have had a massive impact on that cheap end of the Swiss electronic movement. And that is the founding of Daniel Wellington. In 2011, we saw Daniel Wellington come along. In about 2013, I think it was, we see movement come along. And those two are just represent the tip of the iceberg. We also see, they represent the explosion of fashion brands in that cheap and cheerful end, the exact part of the market which the Swiss watch industry has been retreating from. That price range, that dollar value, that technology, that look is everything that's gone from the Swiss watch industry and is everything that's grown between G-Shocks and the fashion watches, Daniel Wellingtons and movements. Now, you can also argue that, and I think it's true, that in particular in 2018-19, we've seen another fall. I'm happy to say that a lot of that is going to be Apple. So the Apple Watch has probably taken us from 14 million down to 11. But by that stage, we've already dropped from almost 23 to 14 million. So I think the vast bulk, the serious structural damage was all done well before the Apple Watch came along and is really the result of there's been nothing particularly Swiss about a watch at that level. And the fact that Movement and Fossil and all these other fashion brands have been scooping that part out. G-Shock came along and became more popular. The Chinese have come along and been selling in that space. And then to just cap it off, the Apple Watch has come on at the end and grabbed a lot of headlines. Anyway, that's my take on what's happened to the Swiss watch industry. Electronics and cheap, gone, and they're going to keep going, and that market may actually vanish for all time. Then what you're going to be left with is high value electronics and mechanical watches, and all the evidence seems to be they're going gangbusters, and there's no problems. What do you think? Do you think I'm looking at this through rose-colored glasses? Do you think that electronic watches, particularly those cheap ones, are inherently Swiss, and this is something the Swiss should worry about? Leave a comment below, and we'll have a chat about it later. Bye.